Welcome to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. The Vancouver Writers Fest connects people to exceptional books, ideas, and dialogue through year-round programming that ignites a passion for words and the world around us. I'm Leslie Hertig, Artistic Director, and I'm very happy to share this conversation featuring acclaimed historian Margaret MacMillan in conversation with UBC Journalism's Kathryn Gretsinger. This event was recorded live on September 29, 2020, as part of the Vancouver Writers Fest's 33rd season. The Vancouver Writers Fest carries out its work, including this event you're about to listen to, on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And now, here is best-selling author Margaret MacMillan speaking with Kathryn Gretsinger about her new book, War: How Conflict Shaped Us, chosen as one of New York Times' top 10 books of 2020.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and a huge thank you to the folks at the Vancouver Writers Festival for making this event even possible. I'd like to acknowledge the incredible support of Leslie Hertig and Clea Young, two women who truly are the minds and hearts behind this year's festival. And it's always an honor to participate. And this year, despite the fact that we are not gathered in a venue huddled together on Granville Island in a theater someplace, we are here together to celebrate words. And this year's event is especially lovely for me. Margaret MacMillan was my teacher. The woman we now know as the celebrated Canadian historian, Emeritus Professor of International History at Oxford and the University of Toronto, Officer of the Order of Canada, the winner of more awards than I could even list here in our time today, the author of 7 titles and internationally broadcast lectures, and so many interviews and articles over the years. She was once a woman who taught me in a classroom full of journalism students, and she taught us all about Chinese history. I used to love her classes. I don't think I ever missed. Margaret's passion for history, her mastery of storytelling and language, and her deep desire to help us learn made those of us at Ryerson love her. We adored her. We would flock to that class, and I'm telling you, we did not flock to all of the others. Her classes helped to shape me as a journalist and now as a teacher, and I'm so deeply grateful to have this opportunity to say thank you in person. Margaret is at Oxford today, joining us from her home there. The new book, as Leslie mentioned, is called War: How Conflict Shaped Us. It is her 7th title, and it's such a pleasure to welcome you today, Margaret.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So good of you to join us. And how are you doing during this mad time that we're all surviving at the moment?
Well, I think like most people, I'm coping, but I'm so impressed with all of you, a connection with Vancouver Literary Festival, because you've had such challenges. And I think it's wonderful that you're carrying on, that you're doing it, that you're reaching out and talking about books. So congratulations to the festival. I think it's I've been there in person, and I wish I could be there in person again, but I compliment you all that you're carrying on so well.
Right. You must be looking forward to getting the book in your hands. It's been a while.
Well, I am, and writing a book is it's very odd. It's a very long gestation period, I suppose you put it like that, and you fiddle around with it, and you look at it, and you think, why did I ever start this wretched thing? And then you work on it, and then suddenly one day a hard copy arrives, and I always have this odd feeling, did I actually do that? But it's a great feeling to get another book done. Now, of course, I'm waiting for reviews, which is always a moment of apprehension, but there we are.
It's an interesting thing with the reviews, because as an interviewer, someone who interacts with the book, you have your own responses, but I always look to those reviews and the commentary from others to sort of frame my approach to, and sitting in a void is an interesting experience. So I'm empathizing in a totally different way.
Well, every writer I know, well, thank you. Every writer I know tends to write in his or her own mind the worst possible review. So you think of all the things that people could pick holes in, see what's wrong with your book. And it's funny. I mean, we don't believe the good reviews. We think, oh, well, they got it wrong, but the bad reviews really sting.
Yeah. What is it? They say you have to hear 7 pieces of positive reinforcement to negate the 1 piece of negative, which really holds that extra weight.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Something I rarely ever do with a book is be predictable and start at the beginning. But I don't believe I have a choice because of the line that you delivered as the very first in this book. War, the word alone raises a range of emotions from horror to admiration. Where did that line come from? And how did that help to orient the story that you went on to tell?
I think it's a line that came out of partly the lectures that I gave and questions I answered, and then questions I asked myself of why are we and why was I fascinated by war? And why are we fascinated by this thing, which is often so horrific? But why do we also see something noble in it? And we have, I think, very mixed feelings towards war. And so I wanted to get at that fundamental sort of paradox at the heart of our relationship with war, that we hate it, we fear it, but we also are fascinated by it. And in some cases, we admire it.
And sometimes we even romanticize it. It becomes sort of this seeking that we have in us to sort of remember or reach for something that war symbolizes.
I think so. And you often get sometimes men who are well past military age saying things like, we need a good war. It helps to pull the country together. It helps to make people less selfish and more selfless. And there's a lot of talk like that before the First World War. And even I think during the invasion and occupation of Iraq, President Bush said, this is something that'll be good for the American people. We're fascinated by war. I don't think we have to like it. But if you go to any bookshop or any library, the rows of books on war tend to be very long, far fewer books on peace. And I think if you look at the movies that are made, even video games, so many of them revolve around war. And so, I think it is something that we continue to be fascinated by.
When did you first recognize your fascination with it?
I'm not sure there was a single moment, but I think I became interested in history very early on. And one of the ways I became interested in history was asking the older people in my family, what was it like when you were young? I mean, I loved the stories from my grandparents of what it was like. My Canadian grandfather said, well, we had to walk 3 miles to school, 4 miles to school in snowstorms. He may have exaggerated a bit, but it was a different world. And I was fascinated by it. And a lot of my own family members, both my grandparents, my father, and 3 or 4 of my uncles were in the Second World War. And so we used to hear stories. And so it was something, the past was something that interested me. How did we get to where we were? What was it like then? What were people's lives like then? But also this fact of these momentous wars, these enormous wars that they had been involved in. And then when I grew up and started to study history seriously, if you study the history of the 19th and 20th centuries, you can't avoid war. I mean, it runs through that history and it helps to shape those centuries.
You've written before that the book about Paris was a passion project. What is this book meant to satisfy for you? What were you trying to figure out about war and our relationship to it?
Well, I think war is something that I've been interested in. When I taught at Ryerson years ago, which is where we first met, I also taught a course in war and society. And so I was interested early on, but in a lot of what I did, war came in sort of tangentially. In the case of China, the Second World War, or the civil war between the communists and the Kuomintang. So it was always something that I was aware of. And I think when I got a chance to give some lectures for the BBC, the BBC's equivalent of the Massey lectures on the CBC, I thought maybe this is the time to tackle war head on. I've dealt with it tangentially, but maybe now is the time to actually look at something which comes in and out of a lot of what I've done and which I'm interested in. And so it was a wonderful opportunity. I mean, giving lectures is a great way to learn about the past. And I found that when I taught you Chinese history. And it's a great way to sort of force you to assemble your thoughts and think through what it is that you're interested in.
And think about storytelling. And that's the thing I recall the most is that every lecture was a story and you were playing with language and you were playing with themes and you were playing with tropes, very similar to the way that you do so in this book. How has your teaching informed the way that you tell stories?
Oh, I think it's been hugely important. I mean, I've taught, I hate to think for how many years, probably 30, 40, 45 years. I taught at Ryerson for a very long time, and then I taught at the University of Toronto, and then I ended up teaching at Oxford. And all my students helped me, I think, over the years to make what I was saying clearer. And I learned to engage their interest. I mean, you can tell very soon if students aren't interested. They have ways of showing it. They look out the window or they, do their emails or whatever. And I found that telling a story was a way to get students interested. And I liked the stories myself. In fact, I dedicated one of my books, I think it was called The Uses and Abuses of History, to my students because they really obliged me to make clear what it was I was saying and to keep them interested if I could.
You've written as well, or perhaps it was something that came out of an interview that I read, that you understand history not as being something that's definitive, but that it is a process and that it evolves over time. How has the evolution of history, in your experience, shaped the way you wanted to approach this particular subject matter? How conflict shaped us?
Well, I think every generation has questions that interested it. And we're interested partly because of what we're going through at the times. And so my generation, there was a war in Vietnam, which went on and on. There was a big civil rights movement in the United States. And I think that got a lot of people interested in how did we get to this point? And what sort of war was it? And why was it being fought in this very, very particular way between the United States and a much smaller country? And then when I was a little bit older in the 1970s, there was a women's movement where women, including me, began to think, we should be able to do things which we haven't been able to do before. And we need to mobilize and organize and define what it is we want. And so women's history became something that we began to look at the past and ask about. And so I think today we're looking again, as we should, every time we think about the past, we should be asking new questions. I mean, I think ecological history is huge now because of what is happening to our environment. The history of slavery is a very big subject now, the history of the indigenous relations with the people who arrived from other parts of the world in the Americas. These are things which have real relevance for us today. And so we go back to the past and we look at the past slightly differently and we ask different questions. I think this should never stop. We should always be asking questions about the past. It doesn't mean there aren't certain facts that are true, and it doesn't mean there isn't good history and bad history. But this process of questioning is something we all do and we all should keep doing.
It's interesting that you raised this process of questioning. I know that you thank many, many people in the acknowledgements of this book. A long line of men who were very generous in supporting and encouraging the work, the historical referencing. Women who have studied war and music, and I'm wondering how you find your own voice in there. What can you, Margaret MacMillan, bring to this subject area that maybe someone else hasn't thought of before?
Well, I think everything well, not everything, but lots of things have been thought about before. But I think what I'm bringing is partly my age. I've lived through a lot. I know a lot of other sorts of histories. And so perhaps I can bring some perspective from that. I started out doing the history of British India. I ended up, as you know, teaching Chinese history, but I also did a lot of the history of the 19th and 20th centuries in other sorts of ways. And so perhaps I bring that knowledge. As a woman, I may bring a certain perspective. One of the things that interested me when I was thinking about war is where do women fit in and how do they fit in? And what does war mean for women? And why is it that so many more men than women have been the fighters in wars? And so I think you bring yourself to it. I've always thought being a Canadian is really helpful when you look at international relations because we are a big country geographically, but we're a small power in the world. And we've always, I think, had a sense of being a small power. And that, I think, means that we don't feel that, unlike an American historian or a British historian, perhaps, or a French historian, where they may feel that they have to either be very critical of their own country or defend their own country. I don't think we have that burden. I think being a Canadian, we have a certain detachment when we look at the world, which I'd like to think makes us look at its history with a certain amount of detachment.
Right. This book covers so much ground. You really do look at women, you look at civilians, you look at different perspectives on war. What was the area that you found the most challenging as an historian, trying to put some particular concept or idea into words?
I think one of the things I found most difficult was trying to understand the impact of technology on fighting. What did it mean when new things came along and how did armies and navies absorb those? And just to understand how the technology worked, to understand what it meant to have a composite bow, for example, rather than one simply made out of a piece of wood, to understand what it meant to be able to have armor on horses and on human beings. What did that actually mean? And so I tried, I needed to understand the technology, but I tried to understand always what it meant for the people who were using it and why certain countries adopted certain technologies and others didn't. Gunpowder was invented in China, but the Chinese, on the whole, didn't do all that much with it compared to the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, and then later on the Europeans. And so these were things that I had to sort of really understand before I could explain them to anyone else.
And now, of course, you're faced with technology today is so technological. People can actually be completely removed from the battleground. So everything from the nuclear arsenal that's continued to be built up, but also these technologies that can be triggered from a satellite and drop down upon people so that humans aren't as engaged with the consequence of war. What do you think that is going to mean in terms of the way that shapes our thinking about war and conflict?
I don't know. I think it may be too soon to tell, but it's a very important question. I think there's been a lot of discussion, a bit of which I've followed, about what does it mean if you're sitting somewhere in Arizona and you have the capacity to use a drone, for example, or call in a strike by perhaps a missile to kill someone in Afghanistan. Does it mean that you don't feel it? Does it mean that you simply do it as if you were playing a video game and you don't feel any responsibility for your actions and for the deaths and suffering that you might have caused? Or do you feel it? I mean, I've heard both. I've heard that people treat it like a video game, but I've also heard that those who are actually doing such things in places, say like Arizona, do actually have to have psychological counseling because they find it very difficult indeed. So I don't know. I think this is something we're now going through another adaptation, as we did once with gunpowder, and as we did once with steel, and as we did once with the internal combustion engine in warfare. And I think we're now having to adapt to this remote kind of warfare. Some warfares have been remote anyway. Bombing cities was in a sense remote, or firing shells which went for 50 miles. You didn't see the consequences of what you did. But I think we're much more likely now to see people on one side of the world inflicting death and destruction on another side of the world. And I think, we'll have to see where this leads us. It's worrying, I think.
It is troubling. You know, I've been thinking a lot about a section of the book where you're writing about the factors that precipitate a war. You know, sometimes people go to war for ideology, and sometimes people go to war to protect turf, or sometimes people go to war for any number of other reasons. When the decision is made, and now these different arsenals are being brought to bear, how are human beings going to be able to calculate the consequence?
Well, we've never been terribly good at calculating consequences, quite frankly. And the thing about war is it's using or attempting to use violence in a controlled way. But so many things can go wrong, and the violence can get out of control. The war itself can get out of control. And the people who planned and initially fought the First World War didn't think it was going to turn out the way it did into on the Western Front, a stalemate. And so I think war has, as von Clausewitz, the great German military theorist, said, war has its own logic. And once you start a war, you are never you cannot be sure how it's going to end up. And that, I think, is what's terrifying about war. And that's what I think is worrying about the present, because we have these huge arsenals. And the idea that we can use them, when people talk about surgical strikes or they talk about limited war, don't believe it, because they are starting something which they may not understand and which may end up in very different ways. I mean, it is, I think, really difficult to predict which way a war is going to go. Very dangerous to start.
It's interesting because when you read about war, and certainly through the pages of this book, there is an attempt over time to control or manage the rules of engagement. That there's this sort of notion that you can manage this and keep it in a box. Yeah. You've proven through the pages of this book and in many of the lectures prior that is not the case. So how is it that people continue to convince themselves that they actually have the power?
Well, it's partly the case, I think. I mean, there have been many attempts down through the ages to control war, and there have been, it's cultural. If both sides accept there are limits on certain things, if both sides, for example, say we will not attack women and children, then those prohibitions do sometimes hold. And if both sides agree that on certain days we won't fight, the Greeks, the Greeks in the classical era didn't fight when the Olympics were on. It was understood that you didn't fight when the Olympics were on. The Aztecs had what they called flower wars, which were highly ritualized, and people did get killed, but you stopped at a certain point, and someone was declared the winner and someone wasn't, rather like a sporting game. There were rules, and there still are rules about how you surrender and what happens to those who surrender. And we've tried to make rules about prisoners of war, and those rules have sometimes been observed, and of course sometimes have been breached. But I think the attempt is not completely unsuccessful. There have been limits on war, and there have been attempts to limit war. But I think my main point is that war in its very nature tends to be unpredictable. And the limits can be broken, and they were certainly broken in the wars of the 20th centuries when one side or other thought there's no point actually obeying these rules.
Right. You posited a question: does society drive war, or does war drive society? Have you come down on one side or the other in that, or are you sort of both?
No, I'm going to do a sort of typical historian's answer and say it's a combination of both. Well, I think it is. I mean, it's so intertwined. I mean, the ways in which different societies fight wars are very much affected by the nature of those societies. And so very hierarchical societies with warrior castes, it's the people at the top of society, the knights in armor, for example, who tend to do the fighting. Other sorts of societies, more democratic societies, more sorts of people do the fighting. And so I think the nature of a war is affected by the nature of the society that's fighting it. But the ways in which society develop are basically also affected by war. And so they move in the direction of, for example, creating bigger empires or having more hierarchy or elevating the warriors to be something special in society. So, and that is a product of war, and it also will produce war. So I really am going to stick in the middle somewhere and not answer your question. Sorry.
That's all right. No worries whatsoever. I'm curious too about globalization and mobility. We're living now. It's such a complex world, and ideas move easily, and people move, well, until the pandemic, people moved easily and so on. And I wonder how you think all of that change is going to shape and affect our idea of history as opposed to histories and the various ways that we can understand what's gone on before.
I think there are so many levels in history, and there are histories of types of people, women, for example, gays. These are histories of minorities of various sorts. These are histories which are and should be written, but they're also national histories. I think you want to know something about the political organization within which you live. And so if you live in Canada, you probably want to know how Canada came into existence, how its government came to be the way it is, how its values came to be the way they are. But we also live in a wider world. And so if we're looking at history, we also probably want to ask, why is it that people have moved around the world? Why is it that we live in an age of globalization, and what has that meant? And what have other ages of globalization been? And so I see history as something many-layered, with many different ways of trying to find out something about the world in which we live. I mean, I think in the end, what drives us in history is partly a curiosity about the past. Certainly in my case, what was it like then? What was it like to live in a different sort of society? And that often can be quite liberating, because you think about different sorts of societies and realize that what you do in your society is not necessarily the only way to do things. And that I think is good for us. Perhaps it teaches us a little bit of humility, that we don't know the answers to everything. But I think what history also can do is help us to understand how we got to where we are. And I think, if you want to understand why there is conflict in the Middle East, for example, and why, there's this endless discussion about what the status of Israel and its relations with its Arab neighbors, you need to know the history, because what both parties, or a number of parties, are remembering helps to explain how they behave in the present. And if you want to understand how China reacts and treats the rest of the world, reacts to and treats the rest of the world, then knowing something of China's history and what it is the Chinese are remembering, I think, is very important. So I think history, and it goes for the history of war as well, if we want to understand the forces that have shaped the world in which we live, then I think we need to know something about the Great Wars, the two World Wars, the Cold War, and a lot of the smaller wars that have really affected so many parts of the world.
We're living through what a lot of people describe as a pronounced period of peace. And in the book you write, like war itself, the peace afterward affects those who fight in many different ways. Nostalgia, pride, hatred of war, post-traumatic stress, anger, sorrow. An American veteran of Vietnam said of that war, and it is impossible to tell if he was glad or not, it has burned away the boy in him and left a man of tempered steel.
Yeah. I still think about that statement, and I don't know what he means. I mean, I don't know whether he's saying this is a good thing or a bad thing, but what he's saying is it changed him. And I think people who are in wars are changed. Some of them don't ever want to talk about it again. I've talked to people whose parents, grandparents were in the First World War, and the First World War was awful for a lot of people, not for everyone. But if you were in certain parts of the trenches on the Western Front, it was awful. And sometimes the people who were in that situation never wanted to talk about it again, although they would often have nightmares. And sometimes people do want to remember it. I mean, there are veterans associations where people get together and talk about the past. So I think there's a whole range of human responses to war. And then, of course, there are the ways that we as societies remember war. What sort of memorials do we put up? What sort of ceremonies do we have? You know, this varies. And again, it varies from generation to generation. I mean, in the 1920s, we may find it hard to believe, but a lot of the people who fought in the First World War remembered it with pride. You know, they saw Remembrance Day not just as mourning those who had died, but they called them our dead heroes. And, you know, as time went by, we began to look at the First World War very differently. And Remembrance Day didn't become something about our dead heroes. It became something more about the terrible losses that the war brought. And so memory is something that does keep changing. And I think how we remember war will change. Again, it's because we change. You know, we are different societies and we think about war differently. But it's something that, you know, still, certainly in the United Kingdom and in countries like Canada and Australia, Remembrance Day, I think, is still important. You know, it's something that for whatever reasons, people want to commemorate and people wear poppies, and it's changed. I mean, we now remember all the dead in wars, as we should, and it shouldn't be just about those who are on the winning side. It should be about everyone who died in war.
This time that we're living through now, there are conflicts in various parts of the world. There are more people moving. There are more refugees than there have been any time in history. There is sort of a sense in the West of peace, notwithstanding what's going on in the United States, which I do want to speak to you about. But how do you think our distance from multi-nation conflicts has shaped the way that we feel about security in the world today?
Well, I think it depends very much on who the we is. I mean, for a lot of Canadians, people like me who was born in Canada, I've never seen a war. I've never come close to war. And yes, I have benefited from a long peace. But there are a lot of people who live in Canada who didn't have that benefit. I mean, there are people who have come from countries such as Vietnam or Iraq, other parts of the world where they have experienced war firsthand. And I think we are fooling ourselves if we think the world has been particularly peaceful since 1945. Certain parts of it have been. And the Americas have been very lucky. I mean, South America has not had a serious war for decades now, and North America has not had a serious war for decades. Europe has not had a serious war. Parts of Asia have not had a serious war, but there are still wars around the world. People are still getting killed. And as you point out, vast numbers of people are refugees because they are fleeing for safety from war-torn zones. I mean, if you start to list, and there is a project, I think it's at the University of Uppsala, in Sweden, which just tries to tally up all the deaths from war since 1945. And the death toll is huge. It depends, of course, on getting the figures right. It depends, of course, on how you count. But the death toll is enormous. The Iraq-Iran war, which a lot of people forget about in the 1980s, 500,000 dead, you know, maybe more. And so I think we need to remember that this has not been peace for everyone by any means.
And this is where I'm wondering, as we come to grips with the more global view of the world, whether that is going to shape or change people's proclivity toward war, toward arms, toward a conflict, as opposed to trying to negotiate some other form of arrangement or way to negotiate.
Well, I mean, on the one hand, this is again a very historian science, but on the one hand, we have built international institutions and we have built up a body of international law which tries to limit war, tries to prevent war. And we've got things like landmine conventions, we've got things like Geneva Conventions, which keep on being elaborated about how prisoners of war and civilians should be treated. And we have institutions like the United Nations and its allied institutions which try and bring peace, try and prevent war, try and mitigate the effects of war. But on the other hand, we have, you know, those who would wage war. I mean, war is still attractive for a lot of people, often people in positions of authority. And what I fear is just because we're more closely linked and the world is more closely linked, peoples in the world are more closely linked through globalization, it doesn't mean we like each other any the better. And often, in fact, small differences can boil up into major confrontations. At the moment, there's a confrontation between Greece and Turkey in the Mediterranean. Now, those are countries which have a great deal in common, which occupy the same geographical space, which could be trading partners, which share in many cases, although neither side likes to admit it, a shared cultural heritage. And yet they are prepared, or at least certain people are preparing to talk in terms of possible war and possible conflict.
And then there's the United States. The saber rattling that's happening there, the president of the United States taking shots at China, the president of the United States using rhetorical language around not handing over power. As someone who has studied history and has watched the precursors to war and has looked at civil war, how are you understanding what is currently going on in the United States?
I am worried about it, I think, as a lot of Americans are. I mean, my American friends sound really quite panicky at times. And I think there are a number of things happening. I think there's a polarization in politics where the middle is being squeezed and you get people identifying either as Republican or Democrat and not trusting the other, which I think is very bad, not recognizing that they share the same democracy and that they should be working within the same set of agreed rules. I think the amassing of weapons is dangerous. I think there are now probably guns for every single man, woman, and child in the United States if they care to have them. And if you have the weapons, the danger always is that someone is going to use them. And of course, we've seen that happening. We have militia appearing, people, self-appointed people marching in uniform and behaving in militaristic ways. And we also have a loss of faith by a lot of Americans in their own institutions. They don't trust those who are elected representatives. They don't trust the civil servants. They don't trust a lot of those in various positions of authority. And you have, in the case of the president, someone who will use a dangerous rhetoric. And I think rhetoric matters. The language you use matters. I mean, before the First World War, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who in some ways reminds me rather of President Trump, he was very boastful and he liked to talk about German power. And in fact, his ministers were much more cautious. But Wilhelm II gave an impression of a Germany that was out of control. And that helped to stir resistance to it and helped to spook countries like Great Britain. And you had in Italy, from 1922 until 1943, you had Benito Mussolini running the country. Again, in some ways, President Trump, there are parallels, I think. Both prided themselves on their masculinity, both prided themselves on their ability to command a stage, both were bigger than life figures in some ways. And Mussolini talked, again, increasingly in his later years, in this way of sort of boasting about Italy, talking about building a second Roman Empire, talking about how Italy was going to be the center of a great empire again, just like the Roman Empire. And in fact, Italy wasn't at all prepared for war. It didn't have the equipment. The soldiers didn't have the things they needed. The Navy didn't have adequate equipment. The Air Force didn't have, for example, proper armor plating on its fighter planes or on its bombers. And in a way, I think Mussolini talked himself into a war. And that's what I think is dangerous. And so when you get someone in a position of authority talking in this way, using these terms, demonizing his opponents as people who are traitorous or don't support the United States or are foolish or whatever or corrupt, I think this is potentially dangerous. I don't want to expect the worst will happen in the United States, but some of the signs that are there are not encouraging. And we've seen how civil wars break out in other countries. You look at the breakup of Yugoslavia, the same sorts of things where the polarization, the use of rhetoric by unscrupulous or demagogic leaders, a lot of weapons, a lot of bitterness. I think and I hope that the institutions and the fundamental democratic underpinnings of the United States are sound. But I think is a very worrying time. And I think the next election and the aftermath of the election are going to be really dangerous.
Last week's comments about the aftermath of the election, someone asked specifically about the peaceful transition, which is, of course, an underpinning of democratic societies. And there was no guarantee of that. When you hear that kind of language and that kind of sort of flip response to something that really is a tenet of democracy, what do you wonder about?
Well, I wonder how much people who make responses like that, and of course this was President Trump's response, actually understand how important it is in democracies that we have really a shared rules of the game. These are not written down necessarily. They're shared norms, shared agreements on the ways in which you do things. And it has always been accepted in the United States that in a presidential election, or in fact in any election, at a certain point, someone will concede. You make a concession, you say, I've lost, you've won. And this is the way that it happens. And so we haven't seen anything like this in the United States before, of someone who said, I'm not going to respect the results of the election. And I think, of course, what is worrying, and there've been people far more expert than me talking about this, but what is worrying is the postal votes will be counted after the ballot boxes are counted. And if there's an early surge for the Republicans, and then suddenly the postal vote shows a surge towards the Democrats, which is likely because more Democrats vote by postal vote than Republicans, then the voices that will be saying the election is rigged, all these postal votes are rigged, will, I'm afraid, grow rather loud. And that's worrying.
Yeah, it's disorienting almost to be watching what's going on and to try to read responses, read journalism, see responses and reactions and try to make sense of it. Yeah. How do you think history might help us to think through this moment in the United States?
Well, what I wish is that some of those who are supporting President Trump, I think for their own ends, I mean, I think there are the people like Senator McConnell who want Trump in office, don't particularly like him perhaps, or don't particularly agree with his policies, but see Trump as the route to the Republicans consolidating their hold on power, of course, consolidating their particular type of Supreme Court. I think they should look at what's happened in the past when you get people who think they can use someone like Trump. I think what's become very clear in the first term is that Trump is not used by anyone. If anything, Trump uses them. Trump has turned the Republican Party into something like Trump. Now, again, the parallel, I think, is too strong. But, if you read the history of the Weimar Republic in Germany, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, but one of the ways in which Hitler and the Nazis got into power, because there were powerful people who didn't particularly like Hitler and the Nazis, but thought we can use them. We can use their votes. We can use this jumped up little Corporal Hitler because he's got a way of talking to people. And once we've used him to get ourselves into power, we'll get rid of him. Right. And that wasn't what happened.
Right. So it's a cautionary tale.
History offers caution. I mean, there are no exact parallels, and history doesn't repeat itself. But it's like a sign on a highway: bad bend ahead. Take care in winter. Roads get icy. Those sorts of signs.
Right. You talk in the book a lot about history and war in our imaginations, and this sort of way that we sentimentalize almost or become nostalgic about what was or what might be. How do you think in 2020 we should be making sense of how conflict shaped us, and how should we be using our reflections to make a way forward?
Well, I think what would help us, I mean, I think perhaps it's my interest, but I think understanding how war has played a huge part in human affairs may make us treat it with a bit more respect. We need to know about it if we want to try and stop it. We really do. And I think we need to be careful about what we say and what we do. We don't want to promote wars. I think we want to try and avert them before they happen. And I think a certain humility about ourselves. I think what we tend to think always, and perhaps every age does this, is we won't be like those stupid people in the past. We won't do what those people did. Well, we will. The past is full of very clever people who thought they really knew what they were doing and didn't. Got into terrible mess. And I think that is something we really need to be aware of.
You write that we probably don't pay enough attention to civilians. And I think that you're writing about that, not just as civilians and the consequence of war, but civilians and the role that they might take and shape. Do you see people who are outside of the military, people who are not in decision-making power, having a role in shaping anti-war or not participating or allowing these things to go forward? In other words, can civilians shape the future?
Well, of course we can. And I think, particularly if we live in democratic societies, we have ways of making our views felt. We can look at those whom we elect and try and elect those who we think will follow policies that we think, if we want a more peaceful world, will lead to a more peaceful world. I think we can organize ourselves. I think we can inform ourselves. I mean, one of the problems is that, of course, we can only worry about so many things at once. And at the moment, we're worrying about the COVID-19. We're worried about the COVID-19. We're worried about the economic, really serious economic consequences of the various lockdowns. We're worrying about climate change. And we're not worrying as much as I think we should be about nuclear proliferation. We're not worrying as much, perhaps, as we should be worrying about the hot spots in the world. I mean, there are a number of spots in the world which I think have the potential for sparking off real conflict. The South China Seas, where the Chinese are attempting to extend their territorial waters on a very flimsy basis indeed, but nevertheless attempting to do it. The clashes up in the high mountains between India and China, which are very worrying. The potential for clashes in the Mediterranean between Greece and Turkey. I mean, there are a number of hotspots. And, just today in the news, there has been trouble between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And the danger with the hotspots is not only will they lead to conflict between the parties nearest at hand, but they always have the danger of drawing in parties from outside. And so in the case of the Azerbaijan-Armenia dispute, which has just flared up today, it already has drawn in Turkey and Russia, for example, and that's worrying. And I think, we have to, I don't want to suggest we should spend our whole time worrying about the world, but I think we need to try and inform ourselves. And I think, certain crises make us look inwards, but I think we shouldn't take our eye off what's happening outside our borders. And I think for Canada, we're in a very difficult position at the moment because we have the United States, which we're very close to, which at the moment is not particularly friendly to us and which we are concerned about. And of course, a lot of Americans are concerned about their own country as well. But can we rely on the United States as much as we used to? I mean, we have lived for a long time since the 1940s, the protective shield, in a sense, provided by the United States.
That we've almost taken for granted.
Yeah, we've taken it for granted. I mean, I sometimes think, for those of you who read Lord of the Rings, I sometimes think we're like the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings. We live in the Shire and we don't realize that there's some really nasty things outside there and some menaces because we have been protected so far.
You close this book with really a beautiful, poignant paragraph, taking us back to a peaceful graveyard in France. We cannot let all memories of war slip away. We need to pay attention to war because it's still with us. And you go on. Can I ask you to revisit that closing paragraph, those thoughts, and perhaps that's where we'll end this conversation.
Well, I was very struck. I mean, I tend to go and see war memorials. It's sort of when I'm a tourist, other people go to I do go to art galleries as well, but I like looking at war memorials and graveyards. And this one in France was very touching because it was of British soldiers who'd been buried there who died in the Napoleonic Wars. So died in 1812, probably. And they'd been buried by locals and the graves were overgrown and the tombstones had fallen down. And it was a very, very peaceful place. And I thought two things, really. I thought, that these people died, most of them probably very young, and that was sad. It was a moment of sadness. But I also thought the earth is covering them over, and gradually, perhaps, the scars that are caused by that war will be covered over. And I think we have to hope that memories of war will in some way fade. It's not that we shouldn't remember wars, but we should perhaps begin to let go of the passions that were aroused in wars. I think we need to think about how we get on with those who were once our enemies. And I think we have done so quite successfully since the Second World War. The ties and the friendship between Germany and its neighbors in Europe, who would have thought that would be possible to see a Germany at the heart of a Europe, a peaceful Germany. And I think we have to remember that societies can evolve and they can move beyond being perhaps warlike and wanting to make war. And so I think it's how we remember the past. I think we shouldn't cling to it as a sort of totem and assume that it defines us totally. I think we need to recognize that the past will change, and sometimes for the better, and sometimes letting go of certain memories from the past or certain emotions from the past can be a good thing.
There's been so much focus on removing statues and changing names of buildings, and there is an erasure that is happening, some for political reasons, some for philosophical reasons, but you're saying a sober, reasoned decision about how we remember is necessary.
I think we should discuss these things democratically, and I'm all for putting things in context. I mean, my own preference is not to take down every memorial to the past, although some of the statues, quite frankly, are very ugly and probably should never have been put up in the first place. But my preference, and it's not always going to be possible, is to put those statues into context and not to take down, for example, as they did in Victoria, the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, but to try and explain who he was. He was a man of his times, and his record, like most of our records, like all of our records, was mixed. And I think we might learn more from that than simply banishing him or banishing a statue or melting it down. But I can see there are times when people want to take down statues and memorials because they didn't want them in the first place, and the memories are so painful. I mean, if I lived in the American South, would I really want a Confederate statue of a Confederate war general? Probably not. And if I lived in Eastern Europe, would I really want a statue of Stalin? No, I probably wouldn't want one because of what Stalin meant for Eastern Europe. And so I think it's got to be case by case. But my preference, if we can do it, is to use them to educate people and make them realize the complexity of the past and the complexity of past figures.
Right. This book has been, as so many of your titles have been, truly extraordinary. How are you going to possibly follow it up? What is the next on your list?
My publishers, I am meant to be working on a book, but I've found, I think, partly COVID distraction. I don't know how everyone else has found it, but I found it hard to concentrate on things at times. I'm meant to be working on a book on the Second World War. So coming up rather slowly towards the present, but very slowly indeed. So that's my plan, to look at the Allied relationships in the Second World War, because a lot of what they did was build the world which we inherited and we're still living in.
And you plan to do that from home in Canada. I understand you're coming back soon.
I'm coming back soon. I know I have to do my quarantine, and I know the Canadians take quarantine very seriously, which I think is a good thing. And so I will come back. It was difficult to travel. I got caught a sense in the UK, so I've been here, and it's been very comfortable. But I'm missing Canada, and I like the Canadian winter. I mean, you people in Vancouver don't get the full experience, perhaps, but and nor do we really in Toronto. But I like the snow, and I hope we get a bit.
All right. Well, I wish you safe travels, and I thank you so much for taking the time for the Vancouver Writers Festival.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and it was lovely to see you again. Really a great pleasure.
Wonderful to see you again, and thank you for all those years and all those great questions that that you helped me to start to form.
Well, you had some wonderful questions of your own today, so thank you very much.
You're welcome. Enjoy. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Margaret MacMillan, the renowned historian, her latest title is called War, How Conflict Shaped Us, and it will be available in the next week or so in Canada, in the United Kingdom, and around the world. If you're keen, though, you could probably get yourself copies online and get the ordering happening soon. But your independent bookstores need you, especially at this time. Thank you to the Vancouver Writers Festival, and thank you again to Margaret MacMillan.
You've been listening to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. To listen to more events like this one, please check out our website at writersfest.bc.ca.